The Seeds of Conflict. Chapter 1, The Great Way. The vastness of space stretched out before Commander Elena Rodriguez, a seemingly infinite canvas of darkness punctuated by distant starlight. From the bridge of the UHS Horizon, she watched the holographic display tracking the complex trade routes through the Great Way, a 300 light-year-wide corridor of unclaimed space that served as the primary economic artery between human territories and the Deru Empire. The Great Way was more than just a navigational zone, it was a delicate ecosystem of commerce, diplomacy, and underlying tension. For nearly a century, the Deru had considered themselves the unofficial protectors of the Regional Commercial Union, RCU, trade stations scattered throughout this region. Their massive fleet of dreadnoughts and carriers had long been the unspoken guarantee of safe passage, a deterrent against piracy and external threats. But everything was about to change. Elena remembered the briefings, the countless strategic meetings that had led to this moment. The Deru were not just traders or protectors, they were monopolists, controlling nearly 70% of luxury goods production within a 30,000 light-year radius. Their economic stranglehold was suffocating emerging markets, including the human commercial sectors that were beginning to challenge their supremacy. Commander, her tactical officer, Lieutenant Marcus Chen, interrupted her thoughts. Long-range scanners are picking up increased Deru fleet movements near the RCU station Epsilon. Elena's dark eyes narrowed. The signs were clear. The Deru were preparing for something more than routine patrols. This was the preliminary dance before an inevitable confrontation. Chapter 2, Economic Warfare. The human approach to conflict was fundamentally different from traditional galactic powers. While most species viewed warfare through the lens of direct military engagement, humans had developed a more nuanced, multidimensional strategy that integrated economic, psychological, and strategic elements. Dr. Ayesha Kapoor, the chief strategic analyst at the United Human Defense Ministry, had been instrumental in developing what would later be called the Systemic Disruption Protocol. Her research had demonstrated that modern conflicts were won long before the first shot was fired, they were won in boardrooms, trade negotiations, and through intricate economic maneuvers. The Deru believe in overwhelming force, she would often tell her junior analysts. We believe in systematic erosion. Our goal isn't to destroy, it's to render their existing systems obsolete. The human strategy was deceptively simple: create alternative economic networks, develop more efficient production methods, and gradually reduce the Deru's market relevance. It wasn't about winning through firepower, but through adaptability and innovation. Chapter 3, The RCU Protectorate. The turning point came when the Regional Commercial Union officially signed a protectorate treaty with the Human Confederacy. This wasn't just a military agreement, it was a profound economic and strategic realignment that would reshape the galactic power dynamics. For the Deru, this was an unforgivable provocation. Their century-long assumption of unchallenged authority in the Great Way was being directly challenged by a species they had long considered technologically inferior. Admiral Krelnax of the Deru High Command saw the human actions as nothing short of a declaration of war. They dare to interfere with our commercial interests, he snarled during a closed-door meeting. They will be taught the meaning of true military might. Little did he know that this very assumption of superiority would be his downfall. Chapter 4, Preparation for Conflict. Human military strategists understood something fundamental: wars are rarely won by the side with the biggest guns, but by the side with the most adaptable strategy. The human fleet was a testament to this philosophy. While the Deru boasted hundreds of massive dreadnoughts and carriers, the human fleet consisted primarily of smaller, more agile vessels, corvettes, destroyers, and frigates that were designed for speed, maneuverability, and rapid strategic repositioning. Commander Rodriguez oversaw the final preparations. Each ship wasn't just a weapon platform, it was a node in a complex, interconnected network. Their communication systems, powered by quantum entanglement technology, allowed for near-instantaneous coordination that the Deru's more hierarchical command structure could never match. We're not preparing to win a traditional battle, she told her senior officers. We're preparing to fight a war that the Deru can't even comprehend. As the first Deru ships began to mass at the borders of the Great Way, humanity was ready. Not with massive guns or overwhelming firepower, but with a strategy that would redefine the very concept of warfare. The conflict was inevitable. But the outcome was anything but certain. The Dance of Shadows. Chapter 5, First Contact. The first shots of the war were not fired in a dramatic space battle, but in the quiet, calculated movements of economic warfare. While Admiral Krelnax prepared his massive fleet for what he believed would be a swift and decisive conquest, human strategists were already several moves ahead. Dr. Ayesha Kapoor's strategic model wasn't just a military plan, it was a comprehensive dismantling of the Deru's entire economic and strategic infrastructure. The human approach was surgical, almost molecular in its precision. Lieutenant Marcus Chen analyzed the initial data streams flooding in from reconnaissance drones. "They're predictable," he muttered to Commander Elena Rodriguez. "Classic hierarchical military doctrine. Linear thinking." The Deru fleet moved like a massive, unwieldy beast, impressive in size, terrifying in potential destructive capability, but fundamentally limited by its own mass and rigid command structure. Each dreadnought was a city-sized weapon of war, bristling with energy cannons and missile batteries, but also slow to maneuver and vulnerable to more agile tactics. Chapter 6, The Quantum Network. What the Deru didn't understand was the humans' quantum communication network. Traditional military communication relied on standard electromagnetic signals, signals that could be intercepted, jammed, or disrupted. The human network operated on a completely different principle, using quantum entanglement to create instantaneous, unhackable communication channels. Dr. Elena Martinez, the lead quantum communication engineer, explained it to the senior military leadership during a briefing. Imagine a communication system where every ship, every drone, every individual soldier is simultaneously a sender and receiver. Not just communicating, but functioning as a collective intelligence. The military commanders listened, some skeptical, others intrigued. This wasn't just a communication strategy, it was a fundamental reimagining of military coordination. Chapter 7, Economic Strangulation. While the military prepared for potential conflict, the economic warfare was already in full swing. Human corporations, working in close coordination with the military and government, began systematically undermining Deru trade routes. It started subtly. Alternative shipping lanes were established, bypassing traditional Deru-controlled trade stations. New production technologies were rapidly developed, making Deru luxury goods incrementally less competitive. Micro-investments were strategically placed in emerging markets, creating economic pressure points that would slowly but inexorably weaken the Deru's economic stranglehold. "We're not destroying their economy," explained Thomas Reyes, the chief economic strategist. "We're rendering it increasingly irrelevant." Chapter 8, The First Engagement. The first actual military engagement came unexpectedly. A small human frigate, the UHS Nighthawk, encountered a Deru patrol squadron near the outer reaches of the RCU trade network. On paper, the encounter was laughably one-sided. The Nighthawk, a sleek corvette barely 300 meters long, faced 3 Deru destroyers, each nearly 2 kilometers in length, with enough firepower to obliterate a small moon. The Deru commander, Captain Zoran AK, didn't even consider the possibility of the human ship surviving. "Transmit surrender protocols," he ordered his communication officer. "They have 10 standard minutes to comply before we initiate destruction sequence." What happened next would become a legendary moment in human military history. The Nighthawk didn't run. It didn't attempt to fight. Instead, it began an impossible dance, a series of quantum-predicted micro-movements that defied traditional space combat algorithms. Using predictive AI and quantum navigation systems, the small human vessel began a series of maneuvers that seemed to bend the very laws of spatial mechanics. It wasn't dodging, it was anticipating. Each movement was calculated not just seconds, but potential quantum iterations ahead. The Deru destroyers fired. Massive energy beams that could slice through planetary shields erupted from their weapon banks. And each time, the Nighthawk was somehow not there. Commander Sarah Liu of the Nighthawk spoke calmly into her communication system. Demonstrating Quantum Evasion Protocol Alpha 7. Recording engagement for strategic analysis. Zoran-AK watched in mounting frustration as his supposedly superior vessels became increasingly ineffective. The human ship wasn't just avoiding destruction, it was making the Deru look fundamentally incompetent. Chapter 9, Psychological Warfare. This wasn't just a military engagement. It was a statement. A declaration that the rules of warfare had changed, and the humans were writing the new rulebook. By the time the engagement concluded, with the Deru destroyers having expended nearly 80% of their energy reserves without landing a single hit, something profound had occurred. It wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a psychological demolition. The message was clear: technological superiority meant nothing if your strategy was obsolete. As reports of the engagement spread through Deru military channels, a slow, creeping uncertainty began to take root. For the first time in a century, the mighty Deru war machine began to feel something it had never experienced before. Doubt. The network of resistance. Chapter 10, Cascading Consequences. The quantum engagement of the Nighthawk was more than just a military victory, it was a paradigm shift that would ripple through the entire galactic power structure. Dr. Aisha Kapoor watched the initial analysis with a mixture of scientific fascination and strategic satisfaction. It's not about the individual battle, she explained to her team of analysts. It's about creating systemic vulnerabilities that compound exponentially. The Deru military leadership was slow to understand the true nature of their emerging challenge. Admiral Krelnax, still operating under traditional warfare doctrine, saw the initial encounters as mere anomalies. His massive fleet continued to prepare for what he believed would be a conventional war of attrition, a conflict where superior firepower would inevitably triumph. What he failed to comprehend was that the humans were fighting an entirely different kind of war. Chapter 11, The Adaptive Network. Commander Elena Rodriguez oversaw the deployment of what human strategists called the Adaptive Response Network, ARN. Unlike traditional military communication systems, the ARN was a living, breathing organism of strategic intelligence. Each human vessel was more than just a weapon platform. It was a node in a vast, quantum-entangled intelligence network that could instantaneously adapt to changing battlefield conditions. Machine learning algorithms processed combat data in microseconds, constantly refining strategies and predicting potential outcomes. Lieutenant Marcus Chen demonstrated the system's capabilities during a strategic briefing. "Watch this," he said, bringing up a holographic simulation of potential engagement scenarios. The display showed hundreds of potential battle configurations, each one morphing and adapting in real time. "Traditional military doctrine says you plan for specific scenarios," Chen explained. "We plan for infinite possibilities." Chapter 12, Economic Warfare Intensifies. While military strategists focused on combat scenarios, the economic warfare reached new levels of sophistication. Human corporations, working in concert with government strategists, began a systematic deconstruction of Deru economic infrastructure. Thomas Reyes, the chief economic strategist, had developed what he called the Fractal Economic Disruption Protocol. Instead of directly confronting Deru economic dominance, human strategists created alternative economic ecosystems that gradually made the existing Deru systems obsolete. New technologies emerged at an unprecedented rate. Quantum manufacturing techniques reduced production costs. Advanced AI-driven logistics networks created more efficient trade routes. Biotechnological innovations produced luxury goods that were simultaneously cheaper and higher quality than Deru products. "We're not competing," Reyes would say. "We're rendering their entire economic model irrelevant." Chapter 13, The Psychological Battlefield. Dr. Elena Martinez, the quantum communication expert, understood something profound about modern conflict: war was increasingly a battle for perception and adaptation. The Deru military was a classic hierarchical structure. Information flowed top-down, strategies were developed by a small cadre of senior leaders, and individual units were expected to follow precise, predetermined protocols. The human approach was fundamentally different. Every soldier, every ship, every drone was both a receiver and a generator of strategic intelligence. The entire human military operated like a distributed neural network, constantly learning, adapting, and evolving. This wasn't just a technological advantage. It was a complete reimagining of military organization. Chapter 14, First Major Engagement. The first major fleet engagement occurred in the Epsilon Quadrant, a strategically critical region of the RCU trade network. A Deru battle group, comprised of 12 massive dreadnoughts and accompanying support vessels, moved to establish a blockade. Admiral Krelnax was confident. His fleet represented the pinnacle of Deru military engineering. Each dreadnought was a city-sized weapon of unparalleled destructive capability. Against such overwhelming force, how could the humans possibly resist? The human response was characteristically unexpected. Instead of a direct confrontation, the human fleet, a collection of smaller, more agile vessels, began what could only be described as a strategic dance. They didn't fight the Deru fleet. They simply existed around it. Quantum-navigated drones created complex interference patterns that disrupted Deru's sensor systems. Advanced electronic warfare suites generated false sensor readings. The massive Deru vessels found themselves firing at phantoms, their enormous weapon systems constantly misled and misdirected. Commander Sarah Liu of the UHS Nighthawk coordinated the engagement with cold, mathematical precision. "We're not here to destroy them," she told her crew. "We're here to demonstrate the fundamental obsolescence of their military doctrine." By the engagement's conclusion, the Deru battle group had expended nearly 70% of its energy reserves. Not a single human vessel had been significantly damaged. More importantly, the psychological impact was devastating. The message was clear: technological superiority meant nothing without adaptive intelligence. Chapter 15, The Turning Point. As reports of the engagement spread, something profound began to happen. The carefully constructed facade of Deru military invincibility started to crack. Subject worlds that had long been under Deru economic and political control began to see possibilities of resistance. Trade partners started exploring alternative economic relationships. The monolithic Deru Empire was revealing its first genuine vulnerabilities. And at the center of this transformation was a fundamentally human approach to conflict, not as a series of battles to be won, but as a complex, adaptive system to be understood and strategically disrupted. The war was far from over. But the trajectory had been irrevocably altered. Systemic collapse. Chapter 16, The Unraveling. The Deru Empire had never known true vulnerability. For centuries, their military and economic might had been so overwhelming that the concept of genuine resistance seemed almost theoretical. But now, the carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. Admiral Krelnax stood in the central command chamber of the Deru High Command, his massive form trembling with barely contained rage. Holographic displays showed a cascading series of failures, economic disruptions, military setbacks, and something far more insidious, a growing loss of confidence among subject worlds. "This is impossible," he growled, his translator struggling to capture the nuanced rage in his native language. "We are the Deru. We do not lose." But they were losing. Not in the traditional sense of military defeat, but in a far more fundamental way. The humans had discovered something profound: true power isn't about overwhelming force, but about systemic adaptability. Chapter 17, The Quantum Intelligence Revolution. Dr. Elena Martinez's quantum communication network had evolved into something far beyond its initial design. What had started as a military communication system had transformed into a living, breathing intelligence ecosystem. Each human vessel, each drone, each strategic node was now part of a distributed neural network that learned and adapted in real time. The system had begun to develop predictive capabilities that bordered on prescience. "It's not artificial intelligence," Martinez explained during a classified briefing. "It's collective intelligence. We're not creating a system that thinks for us, we're creating a system that thinks with us." Lieutenant Marcus Chin demonstrated the system's capabilities. Holographic displays showed potential conflict scenarios playing out simultaneously, not just hundreds, but thousands of potential strategic iterations. The system didn't just predict outcomes, it explored entire possibility spaces. Chapter 18, Economic Deconstruction. Thomas Reyes had transformed economic warfare into an art form. The human approach wasn't about destroying the Deru economic system, it was about rendering it obsolete. New technologies emerged at an unprecedented rate. Quantum manufacturing techniques reduced production costs to a fraction of traditional methods. Advanced biotechnology created luxury goods that were simultaneously cheaper and of higher quality than Deru products. More importantly, the humans created alternative economic networks that systematically bypassed traditional Deru trade routes. It was like watching a river find new channels, gradually eroding the existing landscape. Trade worlds that had been Deru vassals for generations began to see genuine alternatives. The economic stranglehold was being dismantled not through force, but through innovation. Chapter 19, The Psychological Warfare. Commander Sarah Liu understood something fundamental about modern conflict: wars are won in the mind long before they're won on the battlefield. The human strategy wasn't just about military engagement. It was about creating a fundamental crisis of confidence. Every engagement, every economic maneuver was designed to demonstrate the obsolescence of the Deru's existing systems. During a classified strategy session, Liu outlined the psychological component of their approach. "We're not trying to defeat them," she explained. "We're trying to make them defeat themselves." Chapter 20, The Critical Moment. The turning point came in an unexpected location, the Outer Rim Trade Stations of the Regional Commercial Union, RCU. A series of coordinated economic and strategic maneuvers created a cascading effect that would fundamentally alter the galactic power structure. Human-developed quantum communication relays began offering unprecedented levels of secure, instantaneous communication. Trade networks that had been exclusively Deru-controlled suddenly found themselves with viable alternatives. Subject worlds that had long been economic vassals began to see possibilities of genuine independence. The psychological impact was profound, the myth of Deru invincibility was crumbling. Admiral Krelnax watched in mounting horror as decades of carefully constructed imperial control began to unravel. It wasn't a military defeat. It was something far more devastating, a systematic demonstration of the fundamental limitations of their existing system. Chapter 21, The Distributed Resistance. What the Deru failed to understand was the true nature of human strategic thinking. While the Deru saw conflict as a hierarchical, top-down engagement, humans had created a fundamentally different approach. Every individual, every ship, every economic node was simultaneously a strategic asset and an independent decision-making unit. The entire human approach was a living, breathing adaptive system. Dr. Ayesha Kapoor described it as quantum social dynamics, a way of thinking about conflict that transcended traditional military and economic models. "We're not fighting a war," she would later write in her groundbreaking analysis. "We're facilitating a systemic transformation." As the first waves of genuine resistance began to spread through Deru-controlled territories, something profound was happening. The most powerful empire in known space was discovering its fundamental vulnerability, an inability to adapt. The game had changed. And the Deru were only now beginning to realize it. The New Paradigm. Chapter 22, The Moment of Reckoning. The final transformation began not with a massive space battle, but with a quiet meeting in the neutral diplomatic zone of the Epsilon Quadrant. Admiral Krelnax sat across from Commander Elena Rodriguez, the weight of a dying empire pressing down on his massive form. Gone was the bluster of earlier encounters. The Deru understood now what they had failed to comprehend throughout the conflict: this was never about military might, but about fundamental systemic adaptability. How? Krelnax asked, his universal translator rendering his native language into a mixture of defeat and genuine curiosity. How did you manage to dismantle centuries of imperial control without a single decisive military engagement? Rodriguez smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of understanding. We didn't fight your system, she explained. We made it irrelevant. Chapter 23, The Quantum Transformation. Dr.